Alright. So, we're going to start recording now. So, let's start with why you got the property to begin with.
Why I got the property to begin with? I got the property to begin with because we had horses and we were paying pasture to somebody else, and we had already bought a house on 3rd Street in Delta, but we had been looking for another property to buy where we could have our horses on the property.
And you found this house when? 2000?
I found this house in 2001. It was what ended up happening is they had the house for sale for 250,000, and I looked at it, but the payments were a little more than I wanted to make at that point in time. And then 9/11 happened. And my real estate agent called me and told me that Mrs. Kuntz, the person that owned the property at the moment, had already bought another house, and that the sale of the house on I Road had fallen through because the person that was supposed to be buying it, their purchase was contingent on them selling their property. And things just kind of went downhill right after 9/11. And what happened was they ended up dropping the price from 250,000 to 199,000. And so we went down on Thursday and had it all wrapped up by the following Tuesday. We gave them an $18,000 cash down payment. We kept the property on 3rd Street. We got a 2-year lease on it, so we were going to keep that property and use it as a rental. And moved in, and everything was great.
Okay. And what did you do to the property when you moved in? I mean, you moved in and it was the way it was. Then what did you do to the property since you moved in?
Well, we did everything to the property. To begin with, Mrs. Kuntz was up there in age. She had to have been in her late 80s at that point. She had been widowed for about 8 years, and the property was essentially in what I would consider total neglect. And we started off by hauling off 3 flatbed trailerfuls of just what I would consider trash, which was old sheep pens, just, you know, things that they had acquired over the period of time that they had lived on the property. But the first thing that we did was a general cleanup, and then we essentially did everything to the property. We landscaped the property, we re-roofed the house, we re-roofed the shed barn. We had to rebuild the roof on the shed barn. We remodeled total upstairs of the house. We remodeled the 1,700 square foot basement. There just isn't anything that we didn't do to the house. We purchased the house in 2001 for $199,000. In 2006, it appraised for $297,000 from the general cleanup. At that point, my divorce was final in 2005, and so I went down in the beginning of 2006 and took out a $25,000 home equity line of credit and started a subdivision on the property.
And that's where you would take the one single property and you convert it into 3 properties, correct?
Yeah, I converted it into essentially it would have been a 27 lot subdivision because we had the primary property, which was on an acre, and then we took the other 8.5 acres or 9.5 acres, and we had it subdivided into a 26 lot subdivision.
When did you decide to make a subdivision?
Before,
Was that something that you...
Yeah, that was the intentions the whole time.
So when did you actually start on the subdivision? What year?
In 2006.
In 2006, you started it, you had it plotted, you had drawings done, you hired an attorney, and pretty much according to all the records we've seen, that the properties were in fact three separate properties.
Yes. In fact, we have three different appraisals for continuing home equity lines of credit for improvements on the property.
And that was in 2008.
The first one is in 2006 on September 19th, and it clearly shows that the property is 8.5 acres, Lot 1, Corn Minor Subdivision.
Okay. And that the home equity loan you got was for the explicit use of subdividing the property.
Correct.
So you go through the city, you go through the county, everything is done. And when did you believe that the property was no longer part of the mortgage?
In September of 06.
And
Because I dealt exclusively with Heather Rosenberry. We had gone through everything. I paid all the fees. I jumped through all the hoops to create this subdivision. And the person that I was dealing with through Wells Fargo, Heather Rosenberry, told me we were done. And so I listed them with Mason Real Estate on the 18th of October. They were listed for $74,900 a piece because they were 1 acre irrigated in city limits. And
this is in North Delta, right?
yes, this is in North Delta.
Okay.
And as far as I knew, everything was all done. And then that began the confusion of Wells Fargo, I guess I would put it at.
Okay, and so the first time that you noticed something was wrong is when you received a letter.
Yeah, because I dealt with Wells Fargo for 20 years and I'd never had a problem, but essentially they were all simple transactions of just making a payment on time. I'd never been late on a payment the entire time I was on that property.
And what started the first payment missed?
The first payment was missed was on the advice of Wells Fargo in order to qualify for a government program which was supposed to be a home loan modification.
And you've never received any paperwork at that time in regards to any of this information?
No.
This was all done over the telephone, correct?
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to the lot division because that raised a lot of red flags because as far as I knew, everything was all done in September. And we had the appraisal done for the final aspect of everything, and I thought everything was all done. And then I get a letter in December saying that the recording information was wrong.
And who sent you that letter?
Wells Fargo.
Okay.
And so I called Wells Fargo and didn't get an answer, so I left a message and never received a call back. And then about 2 weeks later, I got a letter from them saying that the lots were approved for release, but it was contingent on a payment of $2,685. But I had 6 months to pay it, and it could be held in escrow on the closing of one of the lots. And I didn't bother calling them at that point because I read it and I figured, hey, they got the recording stuff figured out, you know. And I just got to pay him $2,685 on $150,000 worth of lots. So I wasn't real worried about it. Where the concern began was 2 weeks after that when I got another letter from them stating that I owed the same amount, but at that point they were saying that I only had 30 days to pay it. And that, you know, and at that point I was just, what is wrong with you people? First we're done, then you tell me the recording information is wrong, and then you say, essentially, you don't say that everything is all right, but you send me another letter inferring that everything is all right, but I need to pay $2,685, and then you turn around and send me yet another letter which states the same amount, but you change the time limit from 6 months to 30 days. And it's just like, what is wrong with you people? And so at that point, I called up and I spoke to Amy Hill. And essentially, when I called her, I asked her, what is wrong with you people? And told them that I'm thinking about refinancing, even though I've dealt with you exclusively for 20 years, because you can't seem to get simple things straight. Your in house communication seems to be non existent. And so she apologized repeatedly over the phone, told me that it was their mistake. There was no payment due, the lots were all set. And as far as I knew, that was the end of it. And again, the lots were free and clear and for sale.
And that was when?
And on January, I got the letter is dated January 16th. That only gives me 30 days. So allowing for snail mail, I would say it was around January 22nd.
Of what year?
Of '07.
'07. So at the beginning of '07, you surmised that the lots were free and clear, that you owed no additional fundage to Wells Fargo, and since that date, have they ever pursued the $2,800?
No.
Okay. And as of today, was there any explanation given as to why $2,800 was owed, or what problems occurred with the title?
No, it was actually 2685, and I didn't understand it at all. It was referenced to according to their guidelines. But again, the appraisal came in for 297,000 on the 8.5 acres, and the total mortgage at that point in time was 187,000 plus a $25,000 home equity line of credit.
Okay.
So I mean, it was
At that time, what was the property appraised at? Just the
297,000.
And what was owed on it?
Well, let's take 187 and add 25 to it, which I don't even think that we'd use the whole 25. So roughly about 210.
So 210, and the property was
Valued at 297.
so
So I had essentially 50%.
you were below most 20% thresholds that most mortgage companies won't mortgage more than 80% of the property's value.
Correct.
So you were below that.
Yeah, I was sitting, doing math in my head, sitting about 65% probably.
Yeah, and that's if you actually use that full 25,000
Correct.
home equity.
Correct.
Okay. So you didn't hear anything throughout the entire year. What was your next notification from Wells Fargo?
My next notification from Wells Fargo came in August. And that notification was saying that my house payments were going from $1,700 a month to $2,800 a month. And the essential problem with that was they, again, cannot get anything right. I had an adjustable rate mortgage, but the mortgage was supposed to adjust to 9.9% at the very max on the first adjustment. The total that the most that the note could ever be, the highest interest rate that the note could ever be was 12.9%. There were stipulations in there where after the first adjustment it couldn't raise or lower more than 1 point at a time. But essentially what the problem was is it was at a point where my loan should have adjusted. It should have adjusted to 4.385 or 4.375 plus the LIBOR rate.
Right.
Which would have been fine, but instead of that, they adjusted it to the 12.9%, which is why my payment went to $2,800. So essentially, we're back to the fact that they can't do even the simplest things right. My loan adjusted, and instead of adjusting it to the 4.375 plus the LIBOR rate, they adjusted it to 12.9%, which was the maximum amount that I could ever be charged in interest on the
But
mortgage.
which violated the 9.9%.
Yeah, but it didn't follow the mortgage, which said the first adjustment could be no more than 9.9%,
Right.
which would have gave me a payment of $2,100 a month.
Okay.
Instead
And
of
did they
$2,800
give
a
you
month.
any explanation of why it went that high?
Well, I called them up and I essentially told them that I was thinking about refinancing again because they couldn't get anything right on the subdivision. But as far as I knew at that point, all that stuff was all straightened out. And
Because
then
it's been almost a year since
Yeah, it's
they
been-
notified you.
yeah, it'd been
At least 8
months.
months.
Yeah, it'd been 8 months or more since I was told that the lots were free and clear and that it was their mistake and no payment was due. So then I get this letter saying that my payments were adjusting from $1,700 to $2,800, which doesn't follow the mortgage. And so I called them up to essentially ask them what was going on and tell them that, you guys can't seem to get anything right, so I think I'm going to have to refinance. And at that point in time, they talked me into, almost pleadingly, to letting them do a loan modification for me. And they described it as a new government program and that they would look good by helping me by participating in this program. It gave them brownie points with the government or however they were figuring, the banks were doing what they were supposed to be doing.
So basically, you were not having a problem with your mortgage besides the fact that it increased.
Yeah, the problem.
But even with that increase, could you manage that payment?
Oh, easily. And it's easily. I could have made the 28, but what it should have been was 21, which was only like a $300-400 a month adjustment. If they had just adjusted it correctly, I would have never even called them. I would have just, continued to make the
Right.
mortgage payments. The issue is that they adjusted it wrong. And so when I called them up to ask what was going on, they talked me into doing a loan modification for them, assured me over and over again that it wasn't going to negatively affect my credit by telling me, no, everybody's doing it, and assuring me that they were going to report it as part of a loan modification.
So you missed your first payment.
I skipped the September payment because they told me that in order to qualify for the loan modification program, that I had to skip 3 payments.
You had to be in arrears.
They did not tell me that I needed to be in arrears.
But that's what they were hitting at. Is that they couldn't help you unless you've missed payments.
See, and they didn't even say it that way. I guess that's essentially what they were saying, but the way they were explaining it to me was...
It was like a pre-qualification to get this service.
Yeah, it was a qualification. In order to qualify for the program,
You had to
I
have
had
missed
to
three
skip
payments.
3 payments.
Right. So you missed your first payment. What happened to your credit?
When I missed my first payment, my credit, they of course reported it as a non-payment instead of part of a loan modification, but my credit score dropped like 200 points. Every line of credit that I had, except for one, which I can't remember which one it was, but I had about 7 or 8 lines of credit that I was using for 3 different businesses. But I can remember one clear as day. I had a $20,000 limit on the account. I had $1,500 on the account at 4.9% interest. And when I didn't make the payment that Wells Fargo told me that I needed to skip, my new credit limit went to $1,500 from $20,000, and my interest rate went from 4.9% to 29.9%.
So
And that
the
was
funds that you would have available for your businesses were affected by missing that first payment.
I lost over $40,000 in available credit overnight.
Okay.
And
So
then
what
to
did you
make it-
do after that?
What did I do after that? Well, at that point in time, I called up Wells Fargo and asked them what they were doing to me. And they told me that they couldn't help it and to come in January and that they would give me back my house payments. And so essentially, all I did was make all my payments at the exorbitant interest rates until I could go in and try to get stuff straightened out in December because I didn't want my credit screwed up any worse.
Okay. So, and then what happened?
Well, when I called them up in December, they told me that they would call me back in January. And they called me back in January and told me that they had my loan modification ready for me. And over the phone, they told me that I needed to make 3 payments. And the first payment was due on January 19th. And the second payment was due on February 9th. And then I guess the third payment was due on March 9th.
And what happened when you you made the first 2 payments, correct?
Yeah, correct. I made the January payment. I made the February payment. And at that point in time, I decided to just get rid of the 2 lots and get out from underneath Wells Fargo because up to that point, nothing that they had told me was true. You know, they screwed up everything on the land release subdivision aspect of things, but as far as I knew, that was all straightened out. And then they couldn't even adjust the interest rate on my mortgage correctly. And then they lied to me, telling me that it wasn't going to affect my credit. And then, boy, everything was a lie.
So you went to make your third payment that you thought would take you back up. So in your mind, you make this payment, and then next month you pay the whatever it
My
was supposed
normal
to be,
house payment
which they
was.
haven't told you what that payment was going to be yet, right?
Right.
So
Did I move it?
just a little. All right. So you went to go to make the third house payment, and what happened?
Well, it was the morning of the day that I thought the third payment was due. And I had been waiting. What happened was I went to sell the lots in February, and 4 days before the closing on Lot 3 of Corn Minor Subdivision, I got a call from the title company saying that Wells Fargo was blocking me from selling the lots. And so at that point in time, I called up Wells Fargo, and they told me that they understood that the lots were free and clear, but that property values had gone down, and they were freezing my real estate assets because I was doing a loan modification with them. And they told me that in order to get the lots released, I was going to have to pay for another appraisal. And so I went ahead and I gave them $450 over the phone to pay for another appraisal. And my understanding was, as long as the appraisal came in all right, that they would go ahead and release those lots so that I could go ahead and sell them. So I got the appraisals back. Wells Fargo had them ordered them in 2 ways. They had it appraised as an 8.5 acre property, which came in at $458,000. And then they also had it appraised as a 10.5 acre property, and it came in at $487,000. And so again, it's way over what I owe, and so I figured everything's good. And so I gave them a couple of days, called the title company up, and they said Wells Fargo still hasn't released them. Gave them a couple more days, called the title company up. They told me Wells Fargo still hasn't released them. So I called up Wells Fargo, and they told me that they were working on it and to give them a couple more days. And so at that point, I just kept calling them and kept calling them and kept calling them. So when it came to be the day that I thought that the last payment was due, I was essentially, I guess I would have to describe it as livid. because I had been through, at that point in time, about 8 or 9 months of just no idea what was going on. And every time I talked to them, they told me something different. And then every time they told me something, they would actually do something different. And so at this point, this had been going on for coming up on most of a year. And so,
From the time that you received the loan increase back in, that was August, September of '07?
August of '07 is when I got the notification.
But as for any other notifications, you haven't received any paperwork from them since that time.
No, I never received any information on what was supposed to be my loan modification, which I just ended up getting information on that about 2 months ago now. Wells Fargo was responding to some social media comments that I had made and assured me that they were going to get me a specialist to look into this for me. And going through the resolution with Wells Fargo, one of the things that I had requested was a copy of my loan modification and a copy of any foreclosure information that they might have.
And what did they send you?
What they sent me was a piece of paper that they told me was a loan modification, but was actually labeled as a forbearance agreement.
And that was the first time you've ever saw that agreement.
Yes, it was the first time I'd ever saw that agreement. And to make it even worse, on the phone they told me it was a loan modification. It wasn't a loan modification, it was a forbearance agreement. And from everything that I've studied about forbearance agreements, you're supposed to read them very carefully and make sure that they're a situation that you want to enter into. But they did not supply me with the paperwork for the forbearance agreement. They gave me 3 payments over the phone with dates, which they told me I was 1 day late on the last payment. I'm
And
not
what
sure.
date was that?
That was on, as far as I know, March 9th.
That was, and the payment prior to that was due when?
On February 9th.
But the original first payment was on the 19th, correct?
Was on January 19th.
So when the first payment was due to the second payment was less than 30 days.
It was less than 3 weeks.
Yeah. From the second payment to the third payment, it was even less than that, right?
Well, I made the payment on the 9th, and they told me that it was.
It was a day late.
Yeah, they told me that it was due on the 9th instead of the 10th.
They said something that the property was already sold, or
No, I called them up, and again, essentially I was livid, and the purpose of calling them was to try to use the release of the 2 lots as leverage for making the last payment on the loan modification. So my thought was that I could call them up, and essentially what I did was I called them up and I told them that I was supposed to make my last payment today on the loan modification, but that I really didn't even want to make it because I'd been waiting for over a month for them to release these 2 lots. And I really wanted those lots released. And she took my information, my account number, and come back on the phone and told me that I was in foreclosure. I asked her how I was in foreclosure. I was supposed to be making the last payment on my loan modification that day. And she told me that it was 1 day late and they had started foreclosure at 8 o'clock that morning and gave me another 800 number to call. Now, if they'd just sent me the paperwork for the forbearance agreement, which they are trying to say, they say that they sent it to me. But the copy that they sent me is unsigned. I never seen it. And then on top of that, there's a 4th payment that was never discussed on the phone that was over $11,000. It was $11,048 and some change. But it was never even mentioned on the phone. And so that brings me back to what was it? Was it a loan modification or was it a forbearance agreement? It says it's a forbearance agreement, but if you read the rules for a forbearance agreement is supposed to be an agreement for the bank to accept normal or reduced payments for a period of time and to suspend or not begin foreclosure proceedings during the time of the agreement.
And since then, you've learned a little more information. They sent you a letter recently that summarized your case, that really didn't give you any information except for a few dates. When did they say the property sold?
Well, when I called them, they said that the property sold on April 16th, which makes no sense at all. They say that they initiated foreclosure on December 6th, which I do have a letter saying that they initiated foreclosure on December 6th. But I was already talking to them about my loan modification, and my understanding we already had an agreement worked out. And go ahead.
Speaking of that loan modification, you have zero paperwork that was sent to you, either at the time or up to present date, that has anything to do with the loan modification.
Correct.
The only information you got was an unsigned forbearance agreement.
Correct.
And after that, that was it. Have they sent you any information on the serving of the foreclosure documentation?
No.
When did you move out of the house?
We moved out of the house in November. When I talked to them on the phone in March, they told me that they had started foreclosure at 8 o'clock that morning, and that because I was an agricultural property, that I had 8 months to vacate, which, doing the math, gave me until the 16th of November.
So, and you just wanted to be out of there because at that time, there was still, as far as you were concerned, the property was no longer yours, and you basically had to move out or be evicted by the sheriffs come the date.
Yeah, when I called them in March, they told me that I was one day late and they started foreclosure and they gave me another 800 number to call. And so I called the provided 800 number and got the next representative, and the next representative told me to let them look into it and that they would call me back in 2 weeks. They called me back in 2 weeks and said they were still looking into it, which seems to be their mode of operation. And so, told them fine. And when they called me back after the second 2 weeks, their information was that the house was already sold, and as such that there was nothing I could no longer do anything. There was nothing I could any longer do about it.
In the county records, when did the property actually get sold?
In December.
December of 2008.
Yes.
A month after you actually moved out of the property.
Correct.